Imagine standing at one of the most celebrated weddings in modern history. Cameras from every corner of the world are pointed toward a single woman. Jacqueline Kennedy, the elegant widow of President John F. Kennedy, has just arrived on the private Greek island of Scorpios to marry Aristotle Onassis, one of the richest men alive. Newspapers would later call it the wedding of the century. To millions watching from afar, it looked like the perfect ending to a story filled with heartbreak. A woman who had endured public tragedy was finally beginning a new chapter beside a billionaire who could offer security, privacy, and a life beyond the relentless spotlight. But photographs have a way of hiding the most important people in the frame. Standing only a few feet from the bride were two young faces that almost no one noticed. 20-year-old Alexander Onassis and his 17-year-old sister Christina never smiled. They never celebrated. While the world saw a fairy tale, they saw something entirely different. They believed they were watching the final goodbye to the family they had spent years hoping could somehow be reunited. Long before Jackie ever stepped onto that island, they had already decided she would never become part of their lives. For the next 7 years, they would rarely speak her name, refuse to think of her as family, and quietly turn every shared dinner, every vacation, and every gathering into an emotional battlefield fought without raised voices. What followed was not a scandal built on screaming matches or public insults. It was something far more painful. It was the story of a woman trying to enter a family whose hearts had already been closed, two children unable to let go of the mother they believed had been replaced, and a father who discovered that even unimaginable wealth could not buy peace inside his own home. Before we can understand why Jackie was never accepted, we have to go back to a time when Alexander and Christina were still children. When they still believed their family could be whole again.
Long before the world knew Jacqueline Kennedy as Mrs. Onassis, there was another woman sitting at the head of the family table. Her name was Athena Levanos, though everyone simply called her Tina. To Alexander and Christina, she wasn't just their mother, she was the center of their world. Their childhood unfolded among luxury yachts, grand estates, and a fortune beyond imagination, but like so many wealthy families, the beautiful photographs concealed painful cracks. Their father, Aristotle Onassis, had built one of the greatest shipping empires in history through relentless ambition. He was admired, feared, and constantly surrounded by powerful people. Yet the same confidence that made him a titan in business often followed him into his personal life. In 1960, his highly publicized affair with the legendary opera singer Maria Callas shattered the marriage. Newspapers around the world feasted on the scandal. But for Alexander and Christina, it wasn't gossip. It was the day their family fell apart. Children have an extraordinary ability to believe broken things can somehow be repaired. As the years passed, both quietly held on to the hope that their parents might eventually find their way back to one another. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering carried that silent wish. They didn't see their parents as divorced forever. They saw them as temporarily separated. That hope became the lens through which they judged every woman who entered their father's life. A passing romance could be ignored because romances eventually end. A mistress might disappear as quickly as she arrived. But a wife was different. A wife didn't simply visit the family. She replaced someone inside it. In the deeply traditional Greek world the Onassis family came from, loyalty to blood ran deeper than almost anything else. Outsiders could be welcomed politely, but they rarely became insiders. Alexander and Christina believed their mother's place was permanent, even if she no longer lived beside their father. So when whispers began spreading that Aristotle intended to marry Jacqueline Kennedy, they weren't simply hearing news of another relationship. They believed they were watching the final door close on the dream they had carried since childhood. Before Jackie ever met them, before she spoke a single sentence or offered a single smile, the decision had already been made. In their hearts, no woman could ever take Tina's place. Jackie wasn't walking into an empty home. She was walking into a story whose ending had already been written by two grieving children. The wedding ended, but the real story began when the photographers went home. Jackie had become Mrs. Onassis, yet inside the family nothing had changed. On her first evenings aboard Aristotle's famous yacht, she found herself sharing dinner with two young people who barely acknowledged she existed. Alexander answered only when necessary. Christina often avoided eye contact altogether. Conversations that should have brought a new family together never seemed to last. The moment dinner ended, the children quietly disappeared to another part of the yacht, leaving Jackie alone with a husband caught between the woman he loved and the children he loved just as deeply. It became a pattern. Family friends would later describe how Alexander and Christina sometimes left a room the moment Jackie entered it. No insults, no shouting, just silence. A silence that said, "You don't belong here." Even the way they spoke about her revealed the distance they refused to cross. She wasn't Jackie. She wasn't our stepmother. She was simply the American or my father's wife, careful words that kept an invisible wall standing between them. Jackie tried not to fight back. She had spent years mastering the art of remaining calm under the world's attention, but this was different. There were no cameras to smile for and no speeches to hide behind. Every breakfast, every dinner, every holiday reminded her that she wasn't trying to win over strangers. She was trying to earn the acceptance of two grieving children who believed accepting her meant betraying their own mother. The hardest part was that no one was entirely wrong. Jackie wasn't trying to erase Tina from their lives. Alexander and Christina weren't trying to be cruel. They were protecting the memory of the only family they had ever wanted. But good intentions don't always heal broken hearts. Sometimes they simply leave everyone suffering in different ways. As the months turned into years, the silence between them became more powerful than any argument could have been, and Aristotle found himself trapped in the middle, watching the two worlds he loved drift farther apart with every passing day. As the months passed, Aristotle found himself living two completely different lives. When he was alone with Jackie, he saw a woman trying to rebuild her life after losing a husband in front of the entire world. She wasn't loud, demanding, or looking for confrontation. She simply wanted a place to belong. But the moment his children entered the room, everything changed. He became less of a husband and more of a father trying to keep peace between people who no longer wanted peace. Every family gathering became a balancing act. If he defended Jackie, he risked pushing his children further away. If he sided with Alexander and Christina, he watched the woman he had married become more isolated. It was a battle no amount of wealth could solve. Then another problem quietly crept into the family. Money. Newspapers became obsessed with Jackie's lifestyle. Every shopping trip, every renovation, every piece of jewelry became front-page news. Whether the stories were true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated hardly mattered anymore. Alexander and Christina weren't reading headlines looking for facts. They were looking for proof that their fears had been right all along. Every expensive purchase seemed to confirm what they already believed, that Jackie loved the fortune more than the man who had earned it. History cannot tell us whether that judgment was fair, but it tells us something far more important. Once people become convinced of a story, they rarely look for evidence that contradicts it. Jackie could have spent nothing, and suspicion would probably have remained. The children had already reached their verdict long before she unpacked her first suitcase on Scorpios. Meanwhile, Aristotle watched the three people he loved drift farther apart with every passing season. Friends noticed the change in him. The fearless businessman who negotiated with governments and built one of the world's greatest fortunes suddenly seemed powerless inside his own home. He could command fleets of ships across the oceans, but he couldn't persuade two broken-hearted children to open their hearts again. Then fate intervened in a way no one could have imagined. One ordinary January afternoon, a phone call shattered the Onassis family forever. Within hours, the arguments, the resentment, and the hurt feelings that had consumed them for years would no longer seem important. They would all be replaced by something infinitely more painful. Everything changed on January 22, 1973. Alexander Onassis loved flying almost as much as his father loved ships. That afternoon, he climbed into his Piaggio amphibious aircraft, expecting another routine flight from Athens. Minutes after takeoff, something went terribly wrong. The aircraft crashed, leaving the 24-year-old heir with devastating head injuries. For nearly 24 hours, Aristotle refused to leave his son's side. Doctors fought to save Alexander, but the damage was irreversible. Finally, physicians told the family there was no hope. The father who had negotiated billion-dollar shipping contracts now faced the one decision no amount of money could prevent. Aristotle gave permission to remove life support. His only son was gone. Those who knew him said they never saw the same man again. Biographer Nicholas Gage, who spent years interviewing people close to the Onassis family, describe Alexander's death as the moment Aristotle's enormous confidence simply disappeared. Friends who had admired his relentless energy watched it drain away almost overnight. Sarah Bradford would later write that grief became the defining force of Aristotle's remaining years, while William Wright, who interviewed many of Christina's friends and associates, described Alexander's death as a tragedy from which neither his father nor his sister ever emotionally recovered. Even longtime members of the yacht crew noticed the difference. The laughter that once echoed across the decks became rare. Gatherings grew shorter. The man who had filled every room with confidence now spent long periods in silence, staring out toward the sea that had made him one of the richest men on earth. For Jackie, the loss created an impossible situation. She wasn't simply mourning a young man whose life had ended far too soon. She was watching the only person capable of holding the family together slowly disappear into grief. Whatever chance existed of healing the relationship between Jackie and the Onassis children died with Alexander. There were no more opportunities to rebuild trust, no chance to start over, no future family gatherings where old wounds might finally begin to close. Instead, something darker quietly settled over the family. In the months that followed, whispers began spreading through Greek society. Some called it terrible luck. Others reached for something far more sinister. They began asking whether tragedy had followed Jackie Kennedy from America to the Onassis family. Alexander's death left an empty chair at every family gathering, but it also left something far more devastating. It robbed Aristotle Onassis of the future he had spent his entire life building. Friends said he was no longer the unstoppable businessman they had once admired. Nicholas Gage wrote that those close to Aristotle watched him lose interest in the empire that had consumed him for decades. Deals that once excited him no longer mattered. Meetings became shorter. His legendary confidence faded into long periods of silence. Even crew members aboard the Christina O, the yacht that had once hosted royalty, presidents, and movie stars, noticed the change. The laughter disappeared. The celebrations became fewer. The atmosphere that had once felt glamorous now felt heavy with grief. Jackie watched her husband slowly retreat into himself, but there was little she could do. She understood loss better than almost anyone. She had held her dying husband in Dallas as the world watched in horror. Now she was watching another person she loved disappear, not in a single moment, but little by little, day after day. If she reached out to comfort Aristotle, his children sometimes saw it as something she had no right to do. If she stayed back, she appeared distant. It was an impossible position. Then another tragedy struck the family. In October 1974, Alexander and Christina's mother, Tina Levanos, died unexpectedly in Paris. Within less than 2 years, Christina had buried her brother and lost her mother. William Wright, after speaking with people who knew Christina personally, described how those losses transformed her, leaving behind a grief that touched nearly every part of her life. Family friends recall that she became increasingly guarded, trusting very few people outside her closest circle. Looking back, it's difficult to imagine anyone breaking through those emotional walls, least of all Jackie. By then, Jackie was no longer competing with memories of a happy family. She was competing with grief itself. And grief rarely welcomes newcomers. As Aristotle's health continued to decline, everyone around him since that time was running out. What no one knew was that the final chapter of the Onassis family was about to become a battle over something far more complicated than money. It would become a battle over loyalty, legacy, and whether Jackie Kennedy truly belonged in the family at all. As Aristotle's body weakened, the atmosphere around him changed. The man who had once controlled one of the greatest shipping empires in history was now surrounded not by captains and executives, but by doctors, nurses, and family members waiting outside hospital rooms. Those closest to him noticed that business no longer held his attention. Nicholas Gage, whose reporting drew on interviews with people inside the Onassis circle, wrote that Aristotle spoke increasingly about his children rather than his fortune. The billions, the ships, the private island of Scorpios, none of it seemed capable of easing the grief that had settled over him since Alexander's death. Jackie rarely left his side. Visitors remembered seeing her quietly reading to him, helping shield him from the endless demands of the outside world, and trying to preserve what little peace remained. But every hour she spent beside Aristotle deepened the unease felt elsewhere in the family. Christina had already lost her brother. Now she was watching her father slowly disappear as well. Friends later recall that she became fiercely protective of his final months, determined that the family's last memories would belong to them. It wasn't simply a question of inheritance. It was about who truly belonged at Aristotle's side during the closing chapter of his life. Those competing emotions became impossible to separate. Jackie believed she was caring for the man she loved. Christina believed she was protecting the father she was about to lose. Neither woman saw herself as the villain. Yet each viewed the other's presence through the lens of years of hurt that had never healed. Sarah Bradford observed that Jackie genuinely wanted to give Aristotle comfort and stability after the crushing loss of Alexander. But people close to Christina described a daughter who could not forget the pain surrounding her father's second marriage. Every gesture was interpreted differently depending on who witnessed it. When Jackie remained at Aristotle's bedside, some saw a devoted wife. Others saw an outsider occupying a place that could never truly be hers. The tragedy was that no conversation ever came to bridge that divide. Time, which often softens old wounds, was running out. Then, on March 15, 1975, Aristotle Onassis died in Paris at the age of 69. News of his death traveled around the world within hours. Newspapers focused on the fortune he left behind, the famous widow he had married, and the empire he built from almost nothing. But behind the headlines stood a family that had been breaking apart for years. For Christina, it marked the loss of the last parent she had left. For Jackie, it meant saying goodbye to the second great love she had buried. Standing only a few feet apart at the funeral, they shared the same grief, yet remained separated by years of mistrust that neither had ever found the words to heal. The funeral ended, but the silence between Jackie and Christina did not. Mourners returned to their lives, reporters chased the next headline, and the world assumed the story of Aristotle Onassis had come to its final chapter. In reality, it was only beginning. For the first time, there was no husband standing between the two women. No one remained to soften harsh words or explain misunderstood intentions. They were finally left to face one another alone. Family friends later recalled that the atmosphere surrounding the Onassis estate became painfully uncomfortable. Conversations grew formal. Every meeting felt carefully choreographed. It was as though both women understood that one careless sentence could turn years of quiet resentment into an open family war. To the outside world, the battle appeared to be about one thing: money. Newspapers printed astonishing figures, estimating Aristotle's fortune in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and speculation exploded over who would inherit what. Headlines painted Jackie as the glamorous widow who had married the richest man in the world, while Christina was portrayed as the lonely heiress determined to defend her father's empire. But those who actually knew the family described something far more complicated. Nicholas Gage, after interviewing people close to the Onassis circle, wrote that Christina's deepest concern was not simply preserving wealth. She wanted to protect her father's name, his legacy, and the family identity that had already suffered one unbearable loss after another. To her, every legal discussion reopened emotional wounds that had never healed. Jackie found herself in an impossible position. If she remained silent, people assumed she cared only about the inheritance. If she defended herself, critics accused her of proving exactly what they already believed. Sarah Bradford noted that Jackie had grown accustomed to living under relentless public scrutiny, yet even she found the months following Aristotle's death unusually painful. She wasn't just mourning another husband. She was watching strangers, and sometimes even people within the family, reduce an intensely personal loss to gossip about money and wills. Years later, those who knew Jackie would say that this period reminded her of something she had experienced after Dallas. Once again, the world believed it understood her story, while only a handful of people knew what was happening behind closed doors. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of allowing the conflict to drag on for years, Christina made a decision that surprised many observers. After negotiations between lawyers and advisors, she agreed to a settlement that gave Jackie a substantial financial payment in exchange for giving up any future claim to the Onassis estate. It wasn't merely a legal agreement. It was the final acknowledgement that Jackie would never truly become part of the family her husband had hoped to unite. She would leave with extraordinary wealth, but without the one thing money had never been able to buy: the acceptance she had quietly searched for from the day she first stepped onto the island of Scorpios. And as Jackie boarded the plane that carried her away from Greece for the last time, she left behind far more than a fortune. She left behind a family that had never stopped grieving, an island filled with memories too painful to revisit, and one question that historians still debate today: Could anything Jackie Kennedy had done have changed the ending? Or was the Onassis family already broken long before she ever entered their lives?